we're going to continue our discussion of the basics of Buddhism by talking about the seals of the Dharma. And there's some other terms that you'll encounter sometimes describing these, but seals of the Dharma is the one that I like. And there are 4 of these, unless there are only 3. Some traditions only talk about 3 of them, but we're going to talk about 4. And these are really kind of outside of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. This is really the foundation of Buddhist thought. And it's important as we talk about these things to realize that these are not just philosophical concepts. These are all devices you can use to examine how you create stress and suffering for yourself. So the first seal of the Dharma is dukkha, suffering. There is suffering, and that's the first noble truth, basically, is the first seal of the Dharma. The second one is impermanence. Pali term is anicca. All compounded things, that is, all things that arise due to causes and conditions and that are made up of other stuff, which is almost everything, are impermanent and thus subject to change. So all compounded things are ultimately in some way unsatisfactory. And we'll talk about these things some more. I'm just kind of giving you the basic what they are right now. The second seal of the Dharma is not self, the non-self characteristic. The Pali term is anatta. Atta meaning self, and an is kind of the negation. So it's all compounded things are not self. I'm not going to talk about that one much tonight because that's mostly what we're going to talk about next week. And it's the one that it's worth spending a whole talk on, or a whole retreat on. And the fourth one is Nirvana. Nirvana is peace. So there's a Shin Buddhist priest and professor of Buddhist studies in Japan named Kenneth Tanaka. And we sort of corresponded a little bit, so we kind of know each other. I met him on the phone during the Bright Dawn program, and we've corresponded a little bit because he shares my interest in Buddhism and rational emotive behavior therapy. So we've done a little bit of corresponding. And he's got a book called Ocean. And it's kind of presented as a dialogue with Buddhism students. And so to teach the 4 seals of the Dharma to his students, college students, he has this interesting mnemonic device. He says, life is big, B-I-I-G, so 2 I's. The B stands for bumpy, so life is a bumpy road. And that's the principle of dukkha. So disappointments, adversities, all these things are part of life, part of human existence. Birth, death, aging, illness, separation from loved ones, associating with people in situations you don't like. All those things happen. So rather than hope that they don't, or try to deny that they do, or insist that they shouldn't, we can accept them, and we can view these adversities when they occur as steps toward enlightenment. So the first I in this big stands for impermanent, and this is what we're going to talk more about that tonight. Life is impermanent. Nothing stays the same from one moment to the next. Not our bodies, not other people, not conditions, not things. So if you're tying your happiness or your sense of self-esteem or something like that to, a new car, if you're thinking, I'm going to be so happy when I get a new car, which people do this, you'll think, that's what I need. I need a new car. You get the car, and you're ecstatic for a little while, and then it gets a ding in the parking lot, right? And it wears out. And pretty soon it's not really a source of happiness anymore. It's like, I don't want this old car, I want a new car, right? So if you're tying your sense of self or your sense of worth or your sense of well-being to material objects or to relationships or to anything that's made up of other stuff, so basically everything pretty much, then you're ultimately going to be let down, because all compounded things are subject to change and therefore unsatisfactory. So, this can sound kind of bleak. And it is, until you really get it and understand that it's not. There's a very famous story about a woman who came to the Buddha for help. Her name was Kisa Gotami. And the Buddha was staying in this town, and she came up to where he was, and she had this dead child in her arms. And she said, "I've been all over town looking for someone who could make my baby well. And somebody sent me to you. Please, can you help me? Can you give me some medicine to make my baby well?" Well, the Buddha realized that this child was dead, and that she was basically insane with grief. And so he said, "Yeah, I can help you." Oh, she was elated, He said, I can give you some medicine. What I need is 3 mustard seeds." Well, mustard seeds were very common in Indian cooking back then, and so every household had mustard seeds. And he said, but they have to come from a household that has never known death. So she's very excited. She's going to, this holy man is going to make this medicine that's going to make her baby well. And so she leaves and starts going from house to house looking for mustard seeds. And every house she goes to has experienced death. So she comes back to the Buddha, and now she's smiling. She's radiant. She understands that impermanence, mortality, is a part of the cycle of existence. And she ended up ordaining and becoming a fully enlightened being, an arahant. The thing is, she wouldn't have stopped feeling sad. She wouldn't have stopped grieving for her child. But now she can put this into perspective of this is the way life is. These things happen. And so you can accept that sad things happen. You can feel sad, but you don't have to lose your mind over it. The second I in big stands for interdependent. Life is interdependent. And this is about the not self characteristic. And again, I'm going to just skip it for now because we'll talk about it a lot next time. And the final seal of the Dharma, Nirvana, he represents with the G. Life is good. Life is ultimately, fundamentally good. Different traditions and different teachers will talk about Nirvana in different ways. Generally, I think you can look at, the Buddha, when he was pressed to come up with an answer, what is Nirvana, would say that you really can't talk about it, you can only experience it. And so you can't conceptualize it. What I like to do and what I encourage people to do when you encounter one of these, I can't get my head around it, ideas, is think about it as a way to practice. How do I practice this? So how do I practice nirvana, or the idea that nirvana is peace? How do you make that an instruction for practice? So you kind of have to start working with this idea. In a lot of cases, it's going to mean, as we talked about when we talked about renunciation last week, letting go of something that seems to have a payoff, like anger. We cling to our anger. We let go of it and we get peace. Letting go of our greed, our clinging. We let go of what we're clinging to and we can experience peace. So nirvana then becomes the idea that peace is possible, and that peace is possible if I let go of the things that I'm using to get in the way of it, basically. Does that make sense? So, also, nirvana is or that life is fundamentally good. You can use that as a reminder to pay attention to your attention. Whether you see life as good or bad has very little to do with what happens to you. It has almost everything to do with where you're putting your attention. So if you can have a really bad day and it's still a good day. a day is not good because everything that happened was good. A day is good because we had it, and you're supported the whole time. One of the worst days of my life was also one of the best days of my life. I was in an auto accident, January 2000. I came real close to dying. And the reason it's hard for me to get up off the cushions sometimes is because my right knee was pretty badly damaged in that, to the extent that, it's not ever going to really be repaired unless it's replaced. And, I had a collapsed lung, and I was in a lot of pain, and all those things happened. And you could look and go, wow, that was a really bad day then, But on the other hand, there were emergency respondents who came up and cut me out of my car. And there were people who took me in an ambulance to the hospital. And there was a bunch of doctors who showed up and saved my life. So yeah, on the one hand, I was in a lot of pain and I was hurt pretty badly. On the other hand, there's a bunch of people who saved my life. That's a pretty good day. So it's a matter of which are you going to look at? What are you going to use to define your life? So I want to go back to the second seal of the Dharma, well, to the first and second seals of the Dharma, this idea of dukkha and inconstancy. And I mentioned rational emotive behavior therapy a little bit earlier, and I mentioned it a couple of weeks ago too. Just to give you a little bit of background, in the late 80s, early 90s, I was sitting with a group who were practicing Thich Nhat Hanh stuff, and I was also involved with a group who used REBT as a method to overcome drug and alcohol problems and those kinds of things. And I started to notice a lot of congruence between what I was practicing and learning about in Buddhism and what I was practicing and learning about in REBT. And so I kind of kept that in mind for a long time, and this is where the idea of rational Buddhism came up, which, as far as I know, came out of a conversation between me and Albert Ellis's widow a few years ago. And anyway, there are some elements of REBT that really kind of help bring to earth these seals of the Dharma, the idea of dukkha, the idea of impermanence. So the way it works is Albert Ellis, who was the pioneer of cognitive therapy, noticed that there were certain things that people tended to think that led to stress. And there are three basic ones. And one of them is that life should be the way I want it to be. Basically, he said, this is using his words, the conditions under which I live must allow me to get what I want with few hassles. And when they don't, it's too hard. So if you look at the teaching on stress, and the Buddhist, teaching that life is going to have adversities, then obviously those two things, this idea that life has to be the way I want it to be, and when it's not, it's too tough. And the reality of the situation, which is life is tough sometimes, but it's never too hard. Then, you can see that where you start to experience things like low frustration tolerance and depression, anger about situations and sometimes people, those kinds of things, feeling helpless or hopeless, and all those kinds of emotions that come from this idea that life should be the way I want it to be, that life should be relatively easy for me. And we know rationally that that's not true, but we have to remind ourselves in our practice that everything is inconstant, everything is going to change. Things can be really good for a while, and then they're going to be different. We walked in here today and the furniture was different than it usually is. We could freak out about that and say, these people are always rearranging the furniture, what a drag that is, and all of that. Or we could just put it back, and just accept that, conditions aren't always the way we want them to be. And the way we want them to be is really kind of a function of what we're thinking. What what I want is a mental fabrication. There's nothing real about it. We can say, I want to go to the beach tomorrow. and then you wake up and it's raining. And, oh, raining is a bad thing. Well, raining's just something that happens. It's bad because it conflicts with something that we have in our mind, right? So that's always the case. When you're stressed, it's because of some pattern of thought in your mind. And so one of the first things to look at is go, well, okay, am I expecting things to be constant when things are not constant? Am I expecting the person that I, fell in love with to always be exactly the way they were when I fell in love with them? Or can I accept that they're going to change and maybe look different? Certainly I look different, that they're going to have good days and bad days, that we're going to go through rough times. If so, then I find a lot of opportunities in a relationship that otherwise I wouldn't find if I'm holding on to an expectation that things be a certain way. And, it's the same thing with all these other elements of life. I know I'm going to need a car eventually. So why freak out when the car gets dinged in the parking lot? One of the best examples of this that I know of, I used to work in Maitland, and there was a guy who was the head honcho at the company that occupied the top 2 floors of the building that I worked in. And he drove a Ferrari Testarossa. And it was a beautiful car. And it was such a beautiful car that he had to park it crosswise across 3 handicap spots to keep it from getting dinged, because he was so worried about parking lot dings and things like that. And you think about, wow, if I'm holding on to this, if something like that is so important to me that I have to protect it to that extent, then I'm going to be worried all the time about everything. There's a story about a monk who had been a king at one point. And the other monks were worried about him because while he would be meditating in the forest and he'd be yelling out, "What bliss, what bliss!" And so they went to the Buddha and they said, this guy when he goes out to meditate, he sits under a tree and he yells about bliss and stuff. What's wrong with him? And maybe he's remembering when he was a king and how wonderful it was. You really ought to say something to him. And the Buddha says, well, go get him. Tell him to come see me. And so he goes and gets the guy, or they go and get him and bring him to the Buddha. And the Buddha asks him, what is it that you're doing? And he goes, well, I'm remembering when I was a king and how I had to constantly be guarded, worried about thieves, worried about assassins, worried about all these things. I had to be surrounded by guards all the time. And now I don't have to worry about any of that stuff. And that's the bliss. So anyway, that's the 4 seals of the Dharma, and there's kind of the first 2, recognizing that there's stress, recognizing that anything that changes is going to become stressful. It doesn't mean you don't enjoy it. We often put flowers on the altar. We know that flowers are only going to last a brief time. But while they're there, we enjoy them. Okay? You wouldn't say, well, flowers are no good because they're going to be wilted tomorrow or the next day. You enjoy them while they're there, and then you put them in the compost bin so that they can break down and they can nourish the next crop of flowers that you grow. Yeah, you may remember when I talked about the Buddha's search, that he said at one point that he realized, he said, being myself subject to aging, subject to illness, subject to dying, I sought refuge in that which was subject to aging, subject to illness, subject to dying. In other words, things that were subject to change, things that were inconstant. And he said, why don't I instead seek refuge to that which is not subject to aging, subject to illness, subject to dying? In other words, to basically the possibility of nirvana. So when we go for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, we're going for refuge to the deathless, to the things that are not subject to aging, illness, old age, to something that's beyond that. So that's nirvana is unconditioned. Does that make sense? And you can kind of experience that sometimes when in meditation, when things become that still, you can catch a little glimpse of what that might be like. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Well, when he achieved liberation, first he, there was this moment when he was meditating and Mara had sent his armies to try to stop him and all that. And he saw all of his past lives, and then he realized that everything had taken him to that point of liberation. But then afterward, he took several days to just kind of continue to meditate and make sure he hadn't missed anything. And if you read biographies of some of these famous arahants, these people who went all the way and everything, that they'll talk about how when they got to that point, they just kind of know it's all gone. There's no clinging left. Because this is, becoming fully liberated that way, you stop all of the mental fabrications that cling. So stuff will still come up, you might still get angry or whatever, but it just doesn't stay. It just passes so quickly because there's nothing to hold on to it. There's no stains there for anything like that to cling to. Apparently when that happens to you, you just know it. You just realize it. The holy life is fulfilled. It's kind of the standard statement to that. Well, I'm not sure exactly what Peck had in mind, but I think you could see it as there's two things going on in the mind. One is there's the desire to do good, and the other is the clinging to things that we have habitually learned will feel good over the short term. So, if you're a smoker, you smoke a cigarette, you put it out, and you go, that's my last one, right? And it's really easy to make that decision then. But an hour later, when the nicotine's leaving your body, and your body goes, oh, we need some more of that stuff. We need that next, we need that rush that we get from that. It's not so easy, right? So you've got two sets of thoughts going on. You've got one that says, I want to do meritorious things. I want to live a virtuous life. I want to let go of these things that I know create stress. And then you've got these patterns of clinging that are pretty deep rooted. So, yeah, I want to lose weight. Oh, and by the way, I want that piece of chocolate cake. So it's a matter of continuing to let the craving pass, number one, and continuing to reconfirm your desire to transcend that. So when we talked about renunciation, it's a lot easier to do if you've got something good to replace it with, right? So if you, rather than just say, well, I'm not going to do the sin anymore, say, well, I'm going to do the good stuff, right? And then it kind of dilutes, to some extent, for a lot of things, it dilutes the effects of the clinging because you're kind of washing it out with the good things. It depends on what we're talking about. If you're having trouble, like if you're trying to lose weight and you realize you're stress eating late in the day or something like that, you might look for an alternative to that will de-stress you without going to that old habit. So if your usual way of, let's see, if you were trying to cut down on your alcohol, for example, if your usual way of unwinding at 5 o'clock has been to have a martini, and you're trying to cut down on the martinis, well, instead of having the martini at 5, maybe you take the dogs for a walk at 5, something like that, so that you do something healthful instead that also lowers stress. Also, bring compassion to this process, and by this I mean compassion for yourself. Understand that You're the owner of your karma and the heir to your karma. There's been a lot of past action that has led you to this point. So you're a human being, which is a wonderful thing, but human beings come with some karmic baggage. And it may be difficult for you to overcome some things. So don't condemn yourself for that. Take it into stride. Just keep going, keep trying. Okay? And first thing to do is don't get upset at yourself because you failed. You may fail over and over and over again before you succeed. I quit smoking 437 times, but now I don't smoke. So just keep at it, and eventually you'll get where you want to go. And then there'll be something else that you try to get over. You have to go through this again. But that's what leads you to becoming an arahant, is you're constantly letting go of these clingings. That's how you make spiritual progress, is you notice, you hit a wall, you figure out how to get over it, around it, or under it, by just continuing to work at it. Does that make sense? Well, it's different people relate to this in different ways. I mean, some people have a difficult time having compassion for others, and they find it pretty easy to forgive, rationalize, or excuse their own mistakes. Some people are very perfectionistic, and so they have a tough time having compassion for themselves. But just to recognize, like I said, karma brought you here. You can affect what you're doing now. You can't affect what you did in the past, but you can affect the results by focusing on what you're doing now, so that you take things in a different direction. Beating up on yourself is not going to help that process at all. In fact, it will make it worse. So, don't go, oh gosh, I shouldn't do this. I'm such a, bad person or whatever, because how could a bad person do better, right? So you're just a human being. Human beings make mistakes. Work on what's going on right now. Put your attention on the present moment. And wish that you be free from suffering. Making a mistake is stressful. So just as you would see someone else, a close friend or a loved one, who makes mistakes and they suffer as a result, and you look at them and go, oh, may they be free from suffering. May they be free from this stress. Do the same thing for yourself. Accept that you are who you are, where you are. Keep going. I think it's kind of one of the most important things for a Buddhist to work on as you're working on these things, is accepting yourself, where you are. You got to start where you are, and to think that you should be something that you're not, is just not going to be helpful in that regard. So, accept yourself unconditionally, just like you would have metta for all beings unconditionally. Have goodwill, compassion for yourself unconditionally. And then once you do that, then you've got a lot more options, a lot more room to move.